Hello. Welcome back to No Me Callo. I won't stay quiet. I'm your host, Lomelin, and today I want to start this episode with a question that sounds simple, but in reality, it can completely change the way you see your entire story. What happens when one day you realize that your parents didn't know everything? Because nobody prepares you for that moment. Nobody tells you that one day that image you had for them is going to shift. And it doesn't break all at once. It doesn't fall apart. It shifts. Like something that always felt solid suddenly doesn't fit the same way anymore. And the strangest part is that it doesn't happen in a dramatic moment. It's not a big fight, and it's not a conversation you remember word by word. It's not someone sitting you down and explaining everything. It's much quieter than that. It's ordinary, almost invisible. It's a thought that shows up without permission in the middle of a normal day, while you're driving and staring at a red light without really thinking, while you're working and suddenly freeze just looking at your screen, while you're alone in your room and in that silence where your mind starts speaking louder than everything else. And then without warning, it comes, that thought. My parents were also learning. And you say it in your head almost in a whisper, like you don't want to break anything. Like if you say it too loudly, something inside you might shift out of place. Because in that second, you understand something that never quite fit into the way you used to see the world. That the people who raised you, who protected you, who made decisions for you, who seemed steady, firm, unshakable, were also improvising. They were also scared. They were also unsure. They were also learning. And that thought doesn't change how you see them. It changes how you see everything. Everything you thought was stable. Everything you thought was clear. Everything you assumed you understood. Because suddenly, life doesn't feel as absolute as it used to. And something inside you starts quietly rearranging itself without anyone noticing. But you feel it. And that's where right there this episode begins. So the second episode of this series is called The Day I Realized My Parents Were Also Learning. So you know what to do. Get comfortable, grab your coffee, your cafecito, your glass of wine, or a cold beer, and get ready to chismear with me. When we were kids, adults are not just people. They feel like a perfect structure, like the world is being held up by them. Your parents are your safety, your answered, your guy. They are the ones who understand everything you don't understand. The one who translates life for you. The ones who tell you what is dangerous, what is right, and what is acceptable and what is not. They know, they decide, they can handle everything. Or at least that's what we believe. And when you're a child, you don't question that. Not because you're naive, but because you need to believe it. Because that belief gives you peace. It gives you stability. It makes you feel like you're not alone in a world you still don't understand. I remember thinking that. I remember seeing my parents as strong people. People who didn't doubt, who didn't break, who didn't get lost, who always knew what to do, even when I didn't understand anything. I remember my mom with that firmness that as a child felt like absolute certainty. This is how it's done because this is what is right. And in that moment, there was no internal debate. It was simply the truth. I remember my dad solving things that felt impossible to me, problems I couldn't even imagine how to begin solving. And I would look at him thinking, he actually knows how life works. As if there was a moment when adults were giving an invisible manual. And everything just started to make sense. And you grow up with that idea planted so deeply inside you, so deeply that you don't even notice it. You grow up thinking, when I grow up, I'm going to know the same things. I'll have answers, I'll have clarity, I'll have control. But nobody tells you something very important, that growing up doesn't give you answers. It actually gives you questions, and not just simple questions. Questions that can feel uncomfortable. Questions that can feel heavy. Questions that don't always have a place to land. Because as an adult, you start realizing something that didn't exist in your childhood map of the world. That nobody had the full manual, not even them. And then one day, something doesn't feel right. Not necessarily something big, not an event you can clearly point to, but something small, almost invisible, a gesture, a look, a silence that lasts a little longer than usual, an answer that doesn't sound as certain as it used to. Maybe it was an argument. Maybe it was a decision you didn't fully understand. Maybe it was just a day when the atmosphere at home felt different, heavier, more human. And I remember moments when I would see my parents tired, but not the simple kind of tired from working all day. It was a different kind of tired, a deeper one, a quieter one, the kind that is hard to explain when you're a child. It was emotional exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying life without pauses, from holding responsibilities that are invisible, from making decisions without being fully sure that they are the right ones, from continuing because there is no other option. And you look at it from distance, not fully understanding it, but feeling that something in the atmosphere has shifted. And then something strange happens, almost like the world quietly tilts for a second. For the first time, you see them differently, not as parents, not as unbreakable figures, but as people. People with doubts, with exhaustion, with days when they didn't even know what to do either. In that moment, it's deeply confusing. Because nobody prepares you for that. Nobody tells you what to do when the image you had of them starts becoming more human, more real, more complex, and suddenly everything that once felt certain starts to feel a little more fragile. And then something starts to happen that, at least for me, was completely unexpected. You start remembering, but you don't remember the same way anymore. It's like someone takes that same memories and changes the light. The scenes are the same, the people are the same, the words are the same, but now you understand them from a different place. And that can feel deeply emotional. You start remembering phrases that used to bother you, phrases you swore you would never say to your own children, phrases that for years you interpreted as impatient, indifference, or simply unfairness. When you grow up, you'll understand. Because I said so. I don't have time for this. We'll talk later. Not right now. And when you were a child, those words hurt because you didn't understand what was behind them. All you understood was how they made you feel. You would think, why won't they listen to me? Why do they always say no? Why do they never have time? That's not fair. And for a long time, that was your truth. And that truth also deserves to be respected because you were a child, because you were feeling from a place where you were able to feel from. But then you grew up. And one day, those same phrases come back. Only now you're not hearing them with the ears of a child. You're hearing them with the ears of an adult. Someone who also comes home exhausted from work. Someone who also has days where they don't know what decision to make. Someone who also has said at some point, I can't do everything. And suddenly, those phrases start to mean something else. Not because now you think everything was okay, not because the pain disappears, but because you start to understand the context. You start to ask yourself, what if it wasn't control? What if a lot of the time it was fear? What if it wasn't harshness, but the only way they knew how to protect? What if that because I said so wasn't lack of explanation, but that they also didn't know how to put what they felt into words? What if that I don't have time actually meant I'm trying to hold too many things at once and I don't know how to do it better? Because our parents weren't only raising us, they were also paying bills. They were also worrying about work. They were also carrying problems they probably never told us about. They were also dealing with their own wounds, with their own fears, with things they never healed from. And nobody taught them how to do all of that while raising another human being. And that idea can break your heart because suddenly you realize that many of the answers you expected from them, they didn't even have them for themselves. And that's where something very strange happens. Your childhood doesn't change. What changes is the way you see it. And not because it was a lie, not because your memories became invalid, not because the pain disappears, but because you realize the story was always bigger than what you could see. There was a part you didn't know, their part. The one you couldn't see when you were little because simply you couldn't. And when you finally see it, your story stops being one color. It becomes more complex, more human, more real. And maybe that is one of the hardest parts of growing up. Realizing that people you admired most were also just trying to survive. And that your childhood version was never false, just incomplete. Now I want to share something very personal, and I think a lot of people will relate to this. There were moments in my life when I was completely certain. That kind of certainty you only have when you're younger and everything still feels black and white. My parents should have done this differently. They should have known better. They should have reacted differently. And those thoughts didn't come from malice. They came from pain, from confusion, from not understanding why things were the way they were. From that feeling of, if I can see it, why can't they? If I feel this, why don't they see it? And for a long time, I carried those questions like they were absolute truths, as if adulthood was a place where everything suddenly became clear and where people no longer made mistakes. But today, when I look at them from a different place, not from the child I was, but from the adult who is also learning how to hold life, I understand something completely different. They weren't guiding a perfect life. They were improvising, taking deep breaths before making decisions, doing the best that they could with what they had in the moment, with fear, with pressure, with exhaustion, with responsibilities we didn't always get to see, with whatever emotional capacity they had available that day, not necessarily what we wish we had received, with what their own life stories allowed them to give, with things no one ever taught them how to process. And that changes the way you remember everything. Because you start to realize that many of the answers you were looking for, they probably didn't even have either. And that doesn't justify everything. It doesn't erase what hurt. And it doesn't soften what was difficult. It doesn't make the imperfect perfect. But it does explain it in a deeply human way. Because it stops being a story of they failed and starts being a story of people trying to do their best without a clear map. And I think that's what hits the hardest, realizing there was no manual, there was no guarantee, there was no perfect way to do it, only attempts, good days, bad days, decisions made with the heart in your hands and doubt in your chest. And when you start to see that, something inside you also shifts, because you can no longer see them only as parents who should have known. Now you also see them as people who were learning in real time, just like you are right now. And here comes something almost nobody says out loud. Sometimes this understanding doesn't arrive with just peace. It arrives with anger. Because when you realize that your parents were also learning, you start to ask yourself, so who was taking care of me emotionally while they were figuring things out? And that question hurts because it breaks the idea of perfection. It breaks the idea of absolute safety. And it forces you to see them for what they always were, humans trying to do their best. And that changes the way you see them today. Because you don't see them the same way anymore. Now you see them with more compassion, but also with more clarity. You see their limits, their silences, their ways of loving, their ways of protecting, their ways of failing. And you realize something powerful. They were also children before they became parents. And here comes the most important part of this episode, and I think also the hardest one to accept. Because when you start to understand that your parents were also learning, something else starts happening inside you, almost without you noticing. You start to understand something about yourself, something that we don't always want to look at directly. That you are also learning, that you are also improvising, that you are also making decisions without a perfect manual, without clear instructions, without any guarantee that what you're doing is the right thing. And that changes everything. Because suddenly you start to see yourself with a little more compassion, with less harshness, with less of that inner voice that says, you should know better. You should be doing this perfectly. You should have it all figured out by now. And you start realizing something very human, that nobody actually comes into life already knowing. Nobody. Not them, not you. Not the version of yourself you thought you would be by this age. And in that realization, there is something that hurts, but also something that frees you. Because it removes a weight you might not have even realized you were carrying. The weight of expecting perfection in a process that was never perfect to begin with. And it's not about just justifying everything. It's not about ignoring wounds. It's not about us saying everything was okay when it wasn't always okay. It's not about romanticizing the hard parts or erasing what hurt. It's about something much more honest, understanding that life doesn't come with clear instructions. There is no step-by-step guide. There is no single right way to do things. And even love, the love we expect to be perfect, constant, flawless, is also human. Sometimes it's clumsy. Sometimes it doesn't know how to express itself. Sometimes it arrives late. Sometimes it shows up in ways you don't recognize right away. And sometimes it feels harsh on the outside, but inside it was the best someone could give with what they had at the same time. And when you understand that, you start to see life differently, softer, more real, more compassionate. And not because everything was perfect, but because you finally understand it was never supposed to be. And as always, I want to recommend a book, and it's called The Book of Joy by Dalai Lama. And this book connects deeply with this episode because it speaks to something very similar to what we were exploring today. The idea that life is not about doing everything perfectly, but about learning how to hold what hurts with more compassion, and that includes our parents. This book reminds us that we often grow up seeing our parents as strong, almost perfect figures, but over time you start to realize they also had fear, doubt, exhaustion, and that even they were trying to do the best they could with what they had. It's a book that doesn't focus on blaming or pointing out mistakes, but understanding humanity. And it brings you exactly back to that place of compassion, softness, and the understanding that no one is doing life perfectly, but everyone is trying. It's a book that helps you hold something this episode is also asking you to hold. That you can love someone, understand them, and still recognize that they didn't have everything figured out. So I highly recommend it. And I think that the point of this episode is not to stop seeing your parents as parents, but to start seeing them also as people. Because you're no longer just judging the past. You're no longer looking at your childhood through pain or complaint. You're starting to see the full story with more pieces, with more context, with more humanity. And that, even if it doesn't seem like it at first, can feel overwhelming because suddenly you start thinking things like, what if they were also tired? What if they were also scared? What if no one ever taught them how to do it better? What if they were just doing the best they could with what they had? And you don't think it just to justify. You think it because you start to understand. And understanding sometimes hurts more than not understanding because it changes the way you remember everything. From the conversations, the silences, the rules, the decisions, even those moments where you felt unseen or unheard or misunderstood. And they don't disappear. They don't get erased, but they start to feel different. Like they have another texture, another emotional explanation. And maybe that's where the hardest part comes in. Because in that same moment, you start seeing them as human. You also start seeing yourself. And you realize something that can be very powerful. That you're also learning. That you are also improvising. That you are also making decisions without full clarity. Without knowing if tomorrow you'll think differently. Without knowing if today you're doing the right thing. And suddenly you see yourself with less harshness, with less pressure, with less of that inner voice that demands constant perfection. And it's not that everything became justified. It's not that everything became excused. It's not that the pain disappears. It's not that the hard things become easy. It's not about that. It's about something much more human, understanding that nobody comes in already knowing. Nobody has the full manual, not them and not you, and not the version of you that you thought you should already have everything figured out. And that changes the way you breathe life because you start allowing yourself to simply be human with mistakes, with doubts, with attempts, with real-time learning. And maybe that's why this moment in life is not just about understanding your parents. It's about reconciling with the idea that all of us, at some point, were just learning. And maybe that day is the day that you understand everything. And from there, a different story begins. In the description of this episode, you'll find the Amazon link with the complete list of books mentioned in No Me Callo, I Won't Stay Quiet from the very first episode to today. And don't forget that every Friday there's a new episode waiting for you. The third episode of this series is called The Loneliness of Growing Up. And no, it's not the obvious kind of loneliness. It's not being alone in a room. It's not about not having friends. It's not the kind of loneliness people can see from the outside. It's a quieter loneliness, a stranger one, a harder one to explain. It's the loneliness that shows up when you realize you're growing on the inside, but you don't always have someone to process it without on the outside. It's that moment when you start changing, thinking differently, feeling differently, and you realize not everyone around you is in the same emotional chapter as you. And that doesn't mean they don't love you. It doesn't mean you're alone in the world. It means something more uncomfortable, that there are parts of you that are going through that no one else can fully see with you. And that can feel heavy because there are days when you want to explain yourself, when you want to release what you're feeling, when you just want someone to say, yeah, I got it. But that doesn't always happen. And then you start getting used to something new, to thinking more with yourself, to solving more with yourself, to understanding yourself in silence. And suddenly you realize something nobody ever told you about growing up. That there are processes that are completely internal, that no one applauds, that no one sees, that no one fully walks through with you. And that isn't always sad, but it's deeply lonely because you start realizing that even when you're surrounded by people, there are decisions, changes, pain, and versions of you that only you are holding. So in the next episode, we're going to talk exactly about that kind of loneliness that doesn't come from missing people, but from entering a stage where you're no longer the same. And not everyone can follow you there. And maybe the hardest part of all is that it's not a loneliness that goes away quickly. It's one that transforms you. So don't miss it. You were listening to No Me Callo, I Won't Stay Quiet. I'm your host, Jessica Lomelin. Until next time.